involved as well. A Yale and Harvard graduate, Alec has worked as a public defender and civil rights litigator, lectures widely, and has received numerous national awards for his work advocating for indigent defense and challenging mass incarceration. He is the author of Usual Cruelty and Copaganda, writes the Copaganda newsletter, and collaborates across law, media, and arts to imagine holistic safety and an end to human caging and surveillance. So with other introductions, we also have our panelists here tonight, starting with, to my left, Dr. Lauren Bratslavsky. She's an associate professor in the School of Communication. Her primary teaching areas are visual communication, media criticism, media literacy education, and most recently, film festival management, an upcoming honor seminar and satire, with past teaching in media history as well as the First Amendment issues. She's the co-editor of the recently published anthology, The Archivability of Television, Essays in Preservation and Perseverance, and the new director of the student-run Cocktail Film Festival at the Normal Theater in late April. So continuing on, we have Dr. Lisa Schuler-Dooley. Her work, located at the Indices of Assessments, Decolonial Rhetorics, and Rhetorics of Race and Ability, addresses the abuses of power, disrupts hegemonic normativity, and responds to the need for socially just assessment of methodology and methods. Building upon decolonial approaches and progressive assessment scholarship in the fields of rhetoric, decomposition, and technical communication, she considers assessment as it intersects in the cultural theories so we can better recognize and thus intervene in colonial violences within and beyond the classroom, and offers heuristics to recognize when assessment practices are complicit in maintaining quote-unquote normal and to disrupt this violent process. Continuing on, we also have Dr. Bert. He's an assistant professor of art education. He spent nearly 18 years in Chicago as a public school art teacher, art critic, activist, and artist. He's published on issues of race, disability, incarceration, in relation to education and other institutions. He currently teaches courses on art for diverse populations and art integration in early childhood and elementary education. Additionally, we also have Dr. Justin Turner. He's assistant professor of sociology in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. His area of research engages with the complex interplay between state power, violence, and everyday life, with a recent focus on personal safety apps, gamification, and the impact on personal habits. He regularly teaches introduction to sociology, serial killers in society, and criminology. And lastly, we have Dr. Kaitlyn Selman. She's assistant professor in criminal justice sciences and an affiliate faculty member in African American studies. Her research sits at the intersection of critical carceral studies, youth justice, and abolition geography. She is currently studying the Chicago Public Schools reparations, one curriculum, and the legacy of police violence in McLean County. She primarily teaches juvenile justice and race, ethnicity, and criminal justice. So please give a round of applause for our panelists tonight and welcome them to. All right, so kind of giving an outline for tonight, we'll have both Alec discuss his work along with some discussion questions for our panelists until around 6 p.m. this evening, where then we will open it up for questions for the audience until 6:30, and then we'll close out around 6:30 with remaining refreshments and each other's company out in the lobby. So that'll be for the event tonight. All right. So before we jump into our discussions, I would also like to preface tonight with some conversations and expectations. So things, ideas, and findings you may find discomforting as these are ongoing issues that warrant good faith discussions. I would encourage the audience to also decenter themselves to consider views and experience of others, which could ultimately allow you to gain new critical insights into these issues. And be an advocate for others and realize that we are constantly engaged in the process of learning, which opens us the door to gain new perspective and new lenses through which to see these issues. So, Alec, thank you so much again for joining us tonight. Now that we have introduced all the guests this evening, I'd like to turn it over to you. Just so everyone in the audience has an idea of what we'll be discussing tonight, and maybe for those who have not read the book, I was wondering if you can give us a foundational summary and axioms of the book. And this is within context of recent events, and I find this especially pertinent for the events that's been happening, especially with ICE enforcement and the events this past weekend with the shooting of Alec Karakatsanis. We see these kind of double narratives between both the DHS and state departments labeling this past weekend as a domestic terrorist act, as someone who is aggravating ICE officers. But then we have other narratives, like videos and other pieces of information, that counteract that narrative. And so I was wondering if we can use recent examples and other events that's been going on to start introducing the book.
Can you all hear me?
Yes. Good, yes.
All right. So excited to be here. You can see that it's sunny behind me. I'm in a random apartment in Los Angeles, doing a few events here today, so I hope my internet connection is okay. It's actually very hot in here, so I'm sorry I'm wearing a t-shirt, but we don't have any air conditioning, and there's like all this sun in this room, so...
We're in the same mode, don't worry, it's recording out here.
It's not a reflection of the level of respect that I have for this august panel. I am really honored to chat with you guys about this, and I think it's a really important moment for this conversation. I actually had a large white van come here at 5 a.m. this morning, and I went inside the van and did the Democracy Now! Show, talking about these issues, and so it's really on everybody's mind, and I think there's so much that I could say about this moment, but maybe just to follow your prompt, I'll just ground us in a couple of the observations from the book, and then hopefully stop relatively quickly, and we can just maybe have more of a discussion. One thing I want to say that's really important right now is a minor point, but something that I want to tease out given your question about ICE and DHS, and that is that my book is really about very particular kinds of propaganda. I'm studying propaganda that's really arrayed at more liberal people and the sort of general population, well-meaning news consumers. I'm not actually focused in the book on right-wing propaganda, which I think is very important, and there are a lot of interesting things happening in the world of right-wing propaganda, but I think you can understand and study right-wing propaganda using the tools in my book, but I'll just say that all of the examples and the stories and the discussion in my book are really focused at the so-called mainstream or liberal news media and academic institutions and even the sort of nonprofit industrial complex. And what I try to do in the book is I only really talk about the right-wing news ecosystem and right-wing politicians and their rhetoric and their propaganda to show that what the Democratic Party and the mainstream news media and in many cases liberal academia are doing is essentially the same thing. They're just using different framings, different words, sometimes different anecdotes, but actually if you peel away the propaganda layers that are designed to appeal to a different audience, the underlying message about the punishment bureaucracy and about state repression is actually very similar in like the New York Times versus Fox News. Very, very similar if you listen to someone like Chuck Schumer or if you listen to someone like J.D. Vance, by and large. Now, I think there's extra things that you'll see the far right doing increasingly, and I want to point some of those things out just by way of contrast. I think we've seen the right-wing propaganda ecosystem, particularly from some of the leading federal political figures in the last few weeks, in response to the killing of Renee Good, in response to the killing of Alec Karakatsanis in Minneapolis. In both cases, you saw them immediately start to convert into kind of a grotesque attempt to call them domestic terrorists, to say things that were clearly contradicted by the video, right? So making claims about them attacking agents or threatening agents or with a gun or brandishing the weapon even, or all these things. I think you guys have all seen this. And it highlights one of the points that I make in the book, which is that the very best propaganda is propaganda that is actually based on true facts. And if you attempt propaganda that the target audience can sort of easily determine to be false, Is everything okay with the audio? I see people kind of moving around.
Oh yeah, sorry about that.
That was me, my bad. It's a little quiet.
I haven't said anything of interest yet, so don't worry. This is all just sort of a big wind-up. But one of the things that's really important to understand about the very best propaganda is the very best propaganda uses true facts. And the thing that it does is it selectively curates and manipulates those true facts to create false impressions. So propaganda is a lot less effective if the facts that you're basing it on are easily disprovable by the target audience. So for example, if you're a newspaper editor in Chicago and you're interested in getting the public really worried about murder, and you want to, let's say you were a valid propagandist, if you started making up murders that didn't happen, it wouldn't be very effective propaganda. People might come on the news and say, hey, wait a second, the Chicago Tribune said I was dead, but here I am. I wasn't murdered. People are going to stop trusting the Chicago Tribune. But if instead you maybe, in a year where murders are down by 100% or 50% in Chicago, let's say, you could do twice as many stories about the 50% of murders, and you could make, those are all true stories, they're all based on true murders. But by doing twice as many stories in 2025 versus 2024, you could make people feel that murder was up. Does that make sense? So you're creating a false impression by using true facts. The example of sports balls player named Michael Jordan. So anyway, if you haven't heard of him, he played sports balls in Chicago for years, and he is generally considered the greatest player of all time. But let's say there's a young kid growing up in Chicago who's never watched that Jordan play. He's 10 years old or something, or she's 11 years old or whatever. You could make a video of Jordan's career, and you could have like a 9-hour montage videos of just miss after miss after miss after miss after miss. You could just include all of his misses, but remove all of the incredible shots that Jordan hit. And you show this video to this child, and you could convince this kid that this was not a good basketball player, right? In fact, how did this person even make it to the NBA? And so what I've done is, using entirely true anecdotes, selectively curated, I've created the false impression that maybe the greatest basketball player of all time is actually a really bad basketball player. This is what the news media does with crime. It's what the news media does with shoplifting, it's what the news media does with carjacking, it's what the news media does with certain harms perpetrated by certain segments of the population. So it's how moral panics are created about different marginalized communities in societies all across the world. The selective creation of anecdote combined with what I call in the book the volume of news, which is really sort of the frequency and relentlessness of news stories about some topics versus other topics which, if they're covered at all, there's maybe 1 or 2 stories a year on them, right? This creates a really different sense of urgency and impression in the general population, and all of this propaganda is done by really good propagandists, whether they're intentional propagandists or unintentional propagandists. It's done using true facts. That's a really important point. I think all of this is to say, I think some of the far right's propaganda over the last few weeks has really failed, actually, and backfired in the general public, because they're attempting to do propaganda based on untrue facts. And some of the more effective propaganda right now is coming from the Democratic Party. So one of the things that I mentioned in the Democracy Now! Interview today, which is worth highlighting again, is you have all of these Democratic Party officials coming out and saying, we need body cameras, we need police training, we need to invest more money in better tech for ICE and better training programming, etc. This is a slightly different kind of propaganda. I have a whole section in the book on the kinds of propaganda that you see from particularly liberal politicians, mainstream politicians of both parties as well, in the wake of public outrage over violence and brutality in the punishment bureaucracy. There's a whole pattern that they follow, but one of the key things is you always use the system's own violence as an excuse to get the system more money. This is a sort of maxim that we see all the time. And there's several layers of lies or misleading information or sort of the curation of false impression embedded in this. I don't have time to get into them all right now, but I'll just point out one thing that's embedded in this is that the cause of the problem is something that could be fixed through better training, or that body cameras would make the ICE bureaucracy less violent. Now, these are both kind of like flat earther positions, right? So we have overwhelming evidence that body cameras don't make police officers in general less violent. We just know that. And in fact, the person who killed Renee Good and the people who participated in the killing of Alec Karakatsanis were wearing cameras. In fact, one of them was just literally filming himself. And by the way, that person was also a trainer. It's a really good anecdote for just showing the absurdity of the major Democratic Party and liberal pundit talking points right now. It also suggests that these systems and that their primary intention, or maybe the word intention is actually, kind of a unhelpful way of thinking about it. Their primary function, let's say, is to protect the public safety, so it makes it seem like any violence or repression that they engage in is kind of unintentional mishaps or mistakes, and if we just trained them a little bit more and gave them more resources to attend a few more sessions, first of all, that completely ignores what the police training industry is actually like, which I talk about in the book, but let's just leave that aside for a minute. Even assuming the police training industry wasn't one of the most fascist and violent corners of our society, it suggests to people that these systems want to be less violent, less to assert less control and dominance, to not engage in crushing social movements for a more equal society, etc. That's a fundamental lie about what the function of these systems has been for over 150 years, since they really started becoming a little bit more professionalized. So that is a really important lie because, as I talk about in the book, lying to people about why things are happening. Why is it the case that after every major progressive social movement of the 20th century, and every one so far in the 21st century, the police, courts, prosecutors, judges, jails, and prisons have infiltrated and crushed those movements, whether it's women's suffrage, anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, LGBTQ movement, indigenous people movement, anti-genocide movements, etc., etc. It's not because they're poorly trained. If you look back at 2020, there were thousands of videos across the country in the uprisings following the police killings of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and Eric Garner. There were thousands and thousands of videos of intentional criminality by police. It wasn't just a bunch of accidents, right? It was very similar in every major city. And the idea that all of these intentional crimes, by the way, were then overlooked and almost never prosecuted by people in power, and most of the people who engaged in that criminality didn't even lose their jobs, those are all indications that this is actually exactly what the system's function is in these instances of social unrest. So it's extremely misleading for Chris Murphy and Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries and Cory Booker and Amy Klobuchar and all of the leaders of the Democratic Party to essentially be lying to people about the intentions and functions of this bureaucracy. And I just want to make that point clear, and I'll just pause there, and there's so much I could say, but I've already been rambling longer than I intended, and I hope some of that was useful.
Oh, no, thank you so much. Yes, I do want to turn and add to that as well with your talking points in the book and concepts you develop when you talk about and criticize these more liberal institutions, liberal news media, and even academic institutions. In the chapter that you talked about and critiqued the work of the two Harvard professors that argued for more police, and saying that the sloppiness can slip into public discourse about police if not handled well, or if these academic institutions aren't careful in their interpretations of their findings. And before I turn over to the panelists, I was wondering for one last time if you could expand on this kind of critique of academia and how these institutions could perpetuate these talking points, or at least what kind of cautions would you give to current researchers in this institution about handling this properly and with like this academic rigor and integrity?
Well, one prophylactic measure is don't cite anyone who works at Harvard. To really get to the bottom of what's happening over there, don't cite anyone from there. You know, if this is this kind of stuff, this kind of slop that's produced, we got to be really careful. But you know, all kidding aside, actually I wasn't really joking. I don't think you should cite anyone who works at Harvard, but for other reasons too, including the kind of political machinations it takes to become a professor at Harvard, selects for a really a particular kind of person, let's just say. The Harvard professors are a really good example of everything I talk about in the book. And one of the things just to understand is, and this is something you should know, I think I'm speaking to, I can't really, it looks like a bunch of empty rows, but I think I'm speaking to graduate students.
Yes, we have a collection of undergrad, graduate students, faculty, staff members. So they're all
okay, cool.
in the back there.
Okay, great, yeah. It looks like everyone is scared of the front of the room to me. I can't really see past the third row. But assuming there are sentient beings in the audience who are thinking about a career in any of these fields, I would just say, and this is a cautionary tale and something to really confront and to confront openly, which is that your research will be subject to much more significant scrutiny to the extent it challenges people in power. If your research, oh, hello everyone, okay. I can see everyone now. Hello. Thank you for showing me everyone. The Harvard professors were able to publish this total nonsense, and I think if you get to the point in the book where you read that chapter, you'll see, I think, that what they published is total nonsense. But because it was something that was useful to the punishment bureaucracy and to powerful interests in our society, nobody was like, hey, wait a second, like, should we bother making sure this makes sense, right? And instead, it was featured in all these prominent outlets, like The Atlantic and the New York Times, or the Washington Post, et cetera, et cetera. And these people are still teaching classes of Harvard students. But if your work is critical of these institutions, and it starts becoming a threat to the profit and levels of control that these systems are able to exert over communities, then your research is likely going to be subjected to greater scrutiny, to maybe the kind of scrutiny that I subjected their research to. So that's just one point to make for you guys as you think about the work that you do in this. And I'll just say, in terms of the actual Harvard professor's work, I chose them not because they're outliers, but because they represent so much of what is pervasive and wrong in academic criminology, in the legal academy, where I am most familiar with the scholarship, right? So and I think a couple of highlights are, they make these bold public policy pronouncements like, we need 500,000 more police, we need the greatest expansion of police in modern world history, but they don't even bother in making that recommendation to count the social costs of adding 500,000 more police. They don't even bother to examine the research on the negative things that might happen. They don't even bother to examine, well, what are some alternatives that we might examine? And most interestingly, I think maybe most subtly, they also portray themselves as quote-unquote progressives and quote-unquote socialists. This is a really important and subtle point. It's why whenever you have a politician who signs a law signs like a bill into law, you always see them surrounded by like smiling children and and people of faith and whatever nonprofit they can get to stand there, right? There's this idea that, well, if everyone standing next to me were the real estate developers who benefit from this, or the pharmaceutical companies, or the military industrial contractors, the public might not like that. But if I can find some other people to vouch for it, it has sort of a better chance of the public kind of going along with it. This is the role that a lot of academics play in the violence and brutality of the punishment bureaucracy. It's the role that a lot of nonprofits play. So it's very, very important. It's like if you read an article and the group quoted in favor of the policy is like the police union or the leading manufacturer of police surveillance technology, an ordinary reader is going to be like, well, I don't know if I should support that. Like, I don't know if I support the company that makes the weapons for police. I should. So that's why you see in these articles, it's very helpful to always have some random professor being like, oh, well, I vouch for this. Or some person who runs some nice-sounding nonprofit, like, Community Families United for Safety or something, right? And that's why a lot of those groups are just AstroTurf groups. So these Harvard professors, if they had said, we are right-wing, we are the kind of people that have dinner with J.D. Vance every night, and we are all former police union people who now own stocks in the leading manufacturer of police uniforms, you might think, well, of course these guys want 500,000 more police. But the fact that they call themselves and portray themselves as progressives and socialists is actually a propaganda strategy to, it's also helpful for their career because they know if they want to get tenure at Harvard, one of the only ways they can do that is by supporting powerful institutions. But, and so Harvard loves people who call themselves progressives and socialists but who are boosting the police. It's actually a very good career strategy. And the same reason that it's a good strategy for their article to get taken seriously in the mainstream publication. So, there's a lot more to say about it, especially, I go line by line. There's some hilarious parts of the story, like when I email them and ask them for comment, and their response to me was really hilarious. So I hope you get a chance to read that part of the book, because it's a story that does not reflect well on the Academy.
Awesome, thank you so much for that. And I had one more question about when you at the end you had about ameliorating crime with material conditions rather than using the criminal justice system. But I think some of our panelists might comment on that, because I do want to turn it over to them. And so for each one of our panelists, first of all, thank you so much for giving kind of rundown, big axioms of the book and things like this. I would like to kind of turn it to our panelists now to discuss their thoughts on the book, how it relates to their field or their research, and also any other comments or commentary after Alec's summary is here.
Do we have
No order, just the rules.
Okay. You want to start like a linear fashion, or? Sorry, you've been selected to go first.
No.
All right, testing.
It's muted, you got your own.
Okay. All right, testing.
I could go first, but it's going to be out there, and do I get all 50 minutes if I go first?
Sure.
Sweet.
Thanks for coming to my class. All right. I teach in this class and I've never used this mic, so bear with me. If I need to pull it up closer, I will not do that. But nonetheless, all right. So let me start off really quickly. Thanks for having me, Alec. Great book. Thanks for letting me read it. I kind of want to start my discussion off, and one of the reasons I think I can go first is also I don't think I'm here too far off of all of the stories Alec just told, so thanks, Alec, for taking all my points about your book. But that's fine. Before I want to go into it, what I've kind of prepared tonight, I want to reiterate an important kind of sociological aspect of Copaganda, and that it's a reality-making process. It's how we come to understand the world, and that leans heavily into how we learn about the world, right? So our understanding of the world comes from how we learn about the world. Fairly basic stuff, but I think it has major implications when we're talking about something like Copaganda. So learning from a lens of Copaganda means we learn about the world in terms of friends and enemies. of good guys and bad guys, or more basically cops and robbers, right? And while it's important to recognize that there are some really, they put me on a timer. While it's important to recognize that there's some really bad things that happen out there, and nobody, I don't think, in this panel would deny that. By splitting this world into these two kind of categories that Copaganda clearly does, there are some very kind of detrimental impacts on how we as individuals and as a society relate to others in the world. So I think I've kind of found two examples as I was kind of making my little spiel here. I came across two examples that I think kind of fit the ideas of Copaganda and showcase some of my thought here. So let me start with the first example, and this comes from our Bloomington Normals WGLT. They did a recent interview of a former Bloomington police chief, our former Bloomington police chief, Brendan Hefner, who had just retired after serving 7 years as the U.S. Marshal for the Central District of Illinois. So there's this long interview. And in the interview, Hefner touches on a number of issues, but he starts by addressing the tough time that law enforcement is going through at the moment. And he goes on to suggest that this is a tough time that has created less effective officers. And ultimately, he literally blames society here. I'm going to quote his words here to give some clarity. He says, "I think society has taken in expressions of a few in law enforcement and some people in society, not all people in society, have kind of villainized law enforcement and has affected the hiring process." And he goes on to say that it has been tough on hiring because it's kind of a unique situation or oxymoron in that people want us to do better in law enforcement, but some speak bad about us, and that affects candidates or potential applicants applying for law enforcement. And to be clear, right, whatever your thoughts are on those statements, right, the reality is that these are not uncommon statements. I think Alec kind of touched on it a little bit here. We've seen these in, particularly, I noticed these, in the Black Lives Matter movement of 2012, right, when I first started researching on policing. We saw a bunch in the George Floyd uprising across the United States. That this is a discourse one generally finds following incidences of police violence. So I want to be clear, I'm not accusing anyone of anything, but rather looking at what has been printed and captured here. And it's very clearly Copaganda, right? Again, we're not talking about intentionality here, but that's what's happening. So even in research heavily focused on pro-police sentiment in the criminal justice studies department's leading journal, Criminology, that's the leading journal, I think, in criminology. We can all disagree with it, but I think our ASPT said we get merit points for it, so we'll leave it at that. Nonetheless, we continuously see research and findings that suggest that even the most modest acceptance and accountability measures to police use of lethal violence can increase police legitimation. In other words, making efforts to reduce police violence tends to give police legitimacy. A failure to do so, to make these reforms to respond to police violence, tends to impact how the public views the police, right? Very clear relationship there. And yet, what Hefner is saying here is a very tried and true slogan, and we see it all the time, and I think we're seeing it now. Because I think the most worrisome aspect of all of this is that such common slogans and discourse tend to make their way up, make their way down, and spread across are how we relate to these incidences. We don't have to look very far to see this. We can think of Greg Bovino here, who we all probably know as the commander at large of Border Patrol, who said something similar to Hefner just Sunday in an interview. Here, Bovino, I can quote him at length as well, says that when someone chooses to listen to a politician, a so-called journalist, or a community leader that spouts that type of vilification towards law enforcement or anything else, there are consequences and actions there also. I think we saw that yesterday, and this is what he was saying in reference to the execution of Alex Karakatsanis on Saturday. And to me, what is important about this is the deeper logic connecting the local here to the federal, that there's something more than individual officers and individual agencies here, and I think it's important to push past those ideas, and that there's a link that is worth thinking through and talking about. So from a sociological point of view, again, we can explore how this impacts our understandings of the police and in turn our relationships with the police. which again goes back to even just very modest police reform articles, even in popular academic journals in criminology, that there is an impact on police legitimacy that is stemming from their actions. But this rhetoric, I think, is also important in a number of other ways, too. It provides us with a deeper understanding of the police as a function in society, maybe, and even as, more importantly, a power in society. So here I want to kind of take a second and credit Alec's book here, because this type of power cannot and should not be ignored, whether that is through our public kind of confrontations with it or through an academic outlet. In fact, it opens all kinds of questions that I base a lot of my research and writing on. So by thinking through Copaganda, then, we can begin to understand the more explicit forms of coercive power or control that are present in our society. So for instance, we can center critiques of academics, and I think that's very warranted. I don't have to go into the spiel, so Alex has said in me some time. Hear about the Harvard publishing, which again, don't cite people from Harvard. Don't go visit them. Stay away from them. They have good restaurants on the outside of Harvard, which are great. So, so again, in these calls, right, the professors failed to count the police properly. They failed to count crime properly. Right, two really big issues in social science research, miscounting things and purposely being obtuse about it, are problematic in social science research. And when you don't write, you get these pretty gaudy findings, increasing police will increase safety, etc. And the authors in the book even acknowledged and ignored critiques about how they counted the police, and they went ahead and published it. And of course, there's economic incentive here. They get to make more names. They maybe get tenure, which I think Eric had tenure here. The names are more recognizable. They get promotions. They get more and different opportunities for different positions and power. All these economic incentives are wrapped in these publishing things. But I think one thing that we can't forget here is that Copaganda also reveals coercive power, and not just economic power. We see in the examples of the judge who was threatened by the police that Alex talks about. We see in the same instances, in the same videos we're seeing in Maine right now, police knocking on doors, people who've been associated with being legal observers over ICE's mechanisms and tactics. We see it over people who are arrested for sending memes on Facebook about bad that aggravate the sheriff of local communities and places in Tennessee, right? We see it in the ways in which the police oftentimes threaten their public constituencies when there are disputes or issues with how they're being presented by their news, right? So we'll see if police are looking to increase their pay, they'll go on strike, and the threats are, who are you going to call, right? And if we badmouth them, who are you going to call, right? Those are coercive threats, right? There's coercive force behind that. So academically, I would say this is important as it clarifies that often many types of economic control can ultimately be reduced down to this kind of coercive power that we see in Copaganda, that we see in the forms of the police. And I think that's worth studying. And I think that's something that the public finds worth talking about, at least I think that's we're seeing that today. And I got 8 minutes. We done? I can stop, but I'll let you know I'm taking that 30 seconds. And then policing studies, right, we can call this social policing of society. Again, this confronts issues of power. So I'll close with skipping through, so let's pretend like I talked for a minute. I think Copaganda can and does point at the police, but it reveals far more than just the institution or the people who work in those departments, and I think that's the most important message here. And to me, it reveals a deeper logic and power to how we understand our realities and interact with the world. And again, I think that is what I want people to take away. That was 9 minutes on my watch, by the way, just to be clear. I was told
It's slow. Your watch is slow.
the daughter's watch, sorry.
Well, since my field got called out, I guess I'll go next.
Is it not?
Okay, so there's a chapter in Alec's book at the end where he talks about resisting propaganda, and so that's kind of what I'm framing around. Because Alec argues that a critical function of propaganda is manipulating public understandings of what genuinely creates safety in our communities. Together, we're taught from very young ages that a safe society is one with police and with people who trust and cooperate with them. We see this clearly in kids' propaganda, which is kind of my niche side project. These are all of the shows, books, programming that work to get kids to buy into this logic that policing is a necessary and virtuous institution in society. And this messaging also communicates that if you don't automatically see police as the good guys, then you're the bad guy, and you deserve whatever's coming to you. Now, I say all of this with an understanding that my field, bless it, is deeply complicit in perpetuating Copaganda. In criminal justice and criminology, our conceptions of safety are also tied up with policing and prisons. For the vast majority of us with degrees in these fields, we learn to accept policing and prisons as normal. The baseline is that prisons and police are natural, we need them, but we can reform them to make them more humane, but that's really the most that's possible. So in my classes, I'm teaching many people who want to work with or for the system, some of whom I see here, whether that's police, courts, or prisons, and many want to help people. They care about their communities, and they want to work for institutions that pride themselves on protecting and serving. The problem is that those institutions don't do what we've been told that they do. One way to keep people safe is by preventing crime, of course, but the US comparatively has an incredibly high violent crime rate, and we have a massive prison population, so it doesn't seem like we're doing a very good job. The question of whether policing actually keeps us safe by preventing crime is dubious. Despite the best intentions of many people in these institutions, their core function, which is not to cultivate safety for everyone, but rather to curate security for the few, has not changed. Another problematic piece of discourse is our conflation of crime and harm, and Alec gets at this as well. Not everything legally defined as a crime is harmful. I'm sure some of you engage in some of these activities. And not everything harmful is legally defined, policed, or processed as a crime. The category crime has been socially constructed, and it's often leveraged to maintain the marginalized status of the many for the benefit of the powerful few. Harm is more expansive. It includes interpersonal violence, but also violence enacted by corporations and governments, conditions of deprivation like poverty, heterosexism, ableism, and racism, and isolation of all kinds. So if we care about safety, it can't just be safety from crime. It needs to be safety from harm. So what I try to do, and what I do today, is to try to offer a plethora of understandings of safety. So yes, safety can look like lower crime rates, especially interpersonal violence and victimization. I think everyone wants to avoid being the victim of a crime. But I've always been inspired by Miriam Kaba and Andrea Ritchie's definition of safety. And this is a long one, and I will lose my breath, so bear with me. It is a set of resources, relationships, skills, and tools that can be developed, disseminated, and deployed to prevent, interrupt, and heal from harm. That's the definition of safety I work from. So safety can also look like having a safe place to sleep, good food to eat, clean air and water, family and friends to connect with, space to be creative if that's your thing, having people you can turn to when someone hurts you, or who can hold you accountable if you hurt someone else. We tend to think of this as the police, but it rarely is, and it doesn't have to be. So I'm going to give you a few examples. Asada's Daughters in Chicago runs an environmental justice program where young Black Chicagoans receive stipends while being trained in basic gardening and urban farming. They learn about land conservation, food justice, and self-sustainability. This knowledge is then put to work in a community garden that provides local community members with affordable produce, and it serves as an income source. That's safety. In Ypsilanti, Michigan, the Pullover Prevention Program, POP, provides community members with minor car repairs that could be dangerous or also lead to traffic stops, burned out headlights, broken mirrors, etc. This repair clinic also includes free literature, meals, pet food, harm reduction materials, vaccine clinics, and free childcare with activities for the kids while the parents wait. That's safety. The Collective Healing and Transformation Project is a non-law enforcement restorative justice organization that addresses domestic, intimate partner, sexual, and family violence. In their first phase, when they started in 2018, 95.7% of people who called chat for help with violence reported getting the help they needed. 87.9% reported that chat improved their skills to deal with conflict or harm. 70% said that chat adequately addressed their safety concerns, and 57.9% said that their sense of safety improved. This is without relying on police. Now compare this to a 2024 study of sexual violence victims reporting to police, where 58% said that their experience was worse than expected, and 73% reported worsened mental health due to police actions or inactions. Now, addressing crime and addressing harm doesn't have to be separate. When we address safety, we can also impact crime. More examples for you. A 2021 study examined structural housing repairs for low-income homeowners in Philadelphia. 13,632 homes received grants to help repair some of the things in their home, whether that was landscaping or it was appliances or any kind of upgrades that their home needed. Crime rates on the repaired block faces decreased by 21.9%. Assault went down by 19%, robbery went down by 22.6%, and homicide went down by 21.9%. Each additional repaired house, up to 4, continued to reduce crime rates. Housing as crime prevention. A 2022 study examined a little over 3,000 U.S. counties comparing police arrests before and after Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act. Medicaid expansion had considerable impact. Overall arrests reduced by 20 to 32% overall. Drug arrests reduced by 25 to 41%. Violent arrests by 19 to 29%, and low-level arrests by 24 to 28%. So healthcare is crime prevention. A 2017 study analyzed 264 cities over 20 plus years, focusing on local nonprofits during the 1990s to 2010s crime decline. Every 10 additional community organizations per 100,000 residents that focused on crime prevention and community building led to a 9% reduction in the murder rate, 6% reduction in violent crime rate, and 4% reduction in property crime rate. So nonprofits help. These efforts aren't just happening out there, though, they're happening here too. Local organizations like the NAACP, Not in Our Town, Project Oz, the YWCA, Boys and Girls Club, BCAI, our new Bridge Shelter Village, and our local libraries represent our community's capacity to cultivate safety beyond police, and I'm sure I'm missing others that are in here. People in my field, especially because we're training people with a genuine desire to help others, have a responsibility to teach our students about different forms that safety can take and all of the ways that we can help and protect each other. If we want a safe society, we might have to do other things instead of simply building prisons and staffing police forces. That might sound daunting, but the good news is that people and communities have been doing this work for generations. We just have to want to see it. And I'm a minute and a half under.
Okay, hi. Thank you both. I really enjoyed that. I'd like to read that and have it handy. So yeah, my field is art education. So I was an art teacher in Chicago, and I worked all over the city, in quite a bit on the west side and the south side. But my full-time job for 10 years-ish was on the southeast side of the city, working in a majority Black, minority Latinx community. And during that time, I was able to do a lot of art projects with high school students that were, it wasn't all we did, but it was a consistent theme of work that was trying to neighborhood violence, which really evolved into discussions, because I learned a lot while I was there, about police violence and connections to housing and public housing, which was changing a lot when I was a teacher. Eventually, we were able to work with, we did a lot of community projects and made artwork that got to be displayed in various spaces. I had the supreme honor of getting to work with an organization that Marion Cabo was part of, doing a print project in the wake of Trayvon Martin's murder that was on police violence. And also I got the even more kind of sustained and for me, immersive experience of meeting Laurie Jo Reynolds, who's an artist, a Chicago-based artist, who undertook an art project to close the Tam Supermax prison, an art project, which was an organizing project, but she funded it and ran it, professionally framed it as an art project. And that was successful. The Tam Supermax closed in 2013.
And I went to,
think I'm dead. No, I am, sorry. Maybe I am dead. We won't go there. So I was there for 10 years. I ended up going to grad school, and my school was threatened with closure. That happens in Chicago. I ended up writing my dissertation about larger amounts quite a bit, and thinking through many aspects of incarceration and how it relates, and punishment, and how it relates to art and the law. Because Laurie Jo Reynolds' framed short project is legislative art, which is a riff on the legislative theater of the Brazilian playwright, kind of emancipatory playwright, Augusto Boal. While in grad school, I also got involved with some great projects in Champaign-Urbana that built programs on jails, project led by the amazing James Kilgore. And I got to work with the Education Justice Project, which is a college and prison program, but I got to be the coordinator for an incarcerated student-led kind of education mentoring, social emotional development project that's still going, called CAVE. And then in my professional life, I've, I guess teaching is not being professional, but like my professor life is what I would say. Maybe one of the more interesting kind of moments, I've written in various ways about my experiences as a teacher and closure and punishment and making those connections, but I wrote a piece called Press Charges that was a response to this Facebook thread from an art teacher group about an art teacher who put, I think it was a he, himself in the middle of a fight and got punched and was asking the group, I think in good faith, like, should I press charges? I don't know what to do. And it was just this kind of unholy outpouring of, punitive zeal. And I wrote about that and had a lot to say about, my experiences and where those kinds of impulses come from with teachers and schools as carceral institutions. And then I had my own run-in as a result of publishing that and making a video that I actually then had on YouTube and used as part of a conference presentation where I anonymized the Facebook thread, but used it as a background while I presented kind of my article. I was hunted down by it was way less, I'm sure, I can't imagine what Alec deals with. It was really more of a badge of honor than anything. But I got my YouTube canceled through this right-wing AstroTurf group that hassled me over email a few times and then managed to make that happen. So I can't access YouTube. But it's for the best. But actually, and I will end soon. The one thing I wanted to say, which is kind of a nice segue here, is that this is jumping to the present, I really appreciate, I think, Alex book does such a wonderful job of laying out in minute granular detail all of these ways in which, the ideology of policing is manufactured. And I think that two examples that, the way in which ICE has upset the sort of centrist consensus on policing, this sort of, egregious kind of, killing people in the street, unlike police who kill people in the street, according to me myself. Shoring up the ideology of police in the wake of the backlash against the murders of white people in Minneapolis is first an interview on NPR that I heard this morning with this guy, I think his name is Peter Moskos, who's from the John Jay School of Law, who was told the nation, the Chuck Schumer base, that the problem is training. That's there is oh my God, a real cop would never do this stuff. What is he thinking? This is so sloppy. And it was just that was very interesting to just hear that, and then that's paired with a set of AI videos that we're circulating this weekend that I don't know if anyone saw of NYPD cops arresting ICE. That's a totally AI generated phenomenon. There's some real investment in making us think that ICE aren't the police. And I think that, but it's exposing all these contradictions, and I think they sort of rely on the fact that policing is natural, meaning it's always been like that, it's necessary, it's, and I meant the definition of harm and safety that Kaitlyn went through really beautifully is part of that idea of it's natural, it's eternal, it's necessary. Then there's also this unnatural thing, this unnatural, crime wave that is always happening right now. That is always kind of just happening despite, don't let your, lying eyes and brain deceive you. That's, there's an unnatural crisis, and there's this also highly artificial, professionalized, transparent, accountable group of, essentially like bourgeois subjects who will be sure to, keep the, this unnatural nature at bay. And so I just think there's a lot of like really interesting gaps in there, but the last thing I'll say is my favorite quote from the book is that crime isn't the problem and police aren't the solution. And I think that really said it all.
Questions after?
Thank you. I'm an English professor. I teach writing classes, rhetoric, composition, technical communication, and like in my intro, I work at this intersection of assessment and decolonization and biopolitics and the way that people are managed and governed. And I think that when I was thinking about what perpetuates propaganda, I think it's colonization. Colonization perpetuates propaganda. As a granddaughter of 4 Lebanese immigrants living in today's world, I'm still impacted by colonization. So is my family. As a woman, I'm subjected to an updated kind of governmentality that surveils my body and keeps track of it and manages my autonomy and my choices, assesses my potential for success in this neoliberal capitalist society. And all of this does violences on my body and my mind. As a teacher, I witnessed the weaponization of prescriptive normativity. While assessment has found a comfortable home in our education systems and our academic institutions. So my fields are the fields of specifically rhetoric, composition, and technical communication. And in my field, assessment has traditionally been defined similarly as an evaluative tool to determine adherence to an ideal or correct final product. Like I said, I'm a writing teacher. And it's conceptualized in relation to evaluations of student writing or programmatic needs, and usually discussed through a framework of validity and normativity. So, side note, when racist, sexist, classist, heteronormative assessment methods are used, assessment enacts violence on the bodies who are being assessed. And normally they're being assessed by an outside group member who's never been a part of the group that they're assessing. But assessment techniques have been used by immigration and naturalization authorities effectively since they went on the books in the late 1790s. And these approaches and practices colonize the embodied identities of all of those people subjected to that colonization. So there should be, books like this are so important, especially ones that draw upon specific examples that we can prove, right? Because harms are curated to create an inaccurate impression with true facts. I love that. So what kind of response do we have to this? In my work, my response is decolonial methods, so methodologies, methods, pedagogies that directly respond to colonial institutions, systems, and processes that when I talk about colonization, I'm talking about these systems and institutions that were built to exclude, to harm, to name, to number, to oppress the most vulnerable that exist within them. And again, then to act specifically on those bodies. So this is a response mounted by thinking about and sharing and responding to theories, methodologies, methods, pedagogies, approaches that recognize that we are experts of our own selves, and that our lived and embodied experiences and the knowledge that we get from those experiences is the expert knowledge. I tell my students, not my students, I tell the students I teach all the time that we're looking for primary sources here, folks. Like, we're either experiencing it ourselves or we are talking to someone who did. So everything else becomes this like really diluted telephone game that's usually put through some lens of divisiveness. So I think that examples that were given, useful examples like legislative art, like that's incredible. And the work that gets done when people do the work. During the Tams prison closing time, I was doing a lot of work and advocacy in keeping adult transition centers open in Illinois because Quinn was closing them, and the recidivism rates are greatly impacted by something as simple as having a job. My experience in there as an advocate was also incredibly personal. I had a loved one that I was praying would end up in an adult transition center right at the time that the governor was closing them. And so my advocacy was based on my embodied experience and knowledge, right? But also there were facts. There were things we could go to. We could use the facts as they are, not to skew them in some bureaucratic lens, through this bureaucratic lens of like, how are we going to save money and where are we putting our money towards? Like, that wasn't it. Again, it's this. These are all slow violences. These are violences, like Rob Nixon talks about, these slow violences. They're violences that permeate assessment practices and practices in general. And Nixon describes them as violences that are incremental, persistent, that occur gradually and out of sight. He parses this sort of differentiation between singular violent events and accumulative violences. As, quote, conceived as an event or action that is immediate in time, explosive and spectacular in space, and erupting into instant sensational visibility. And violence that is neither spectacular nor instantaneous, but rather incremental and accretive. Its calamitous repercussions playing out across a range of temporal scales. So these slow violences reside in the psyche and they imprint on the flesh of those that they inflict. And they're cumulative and exponential in impact and impose long-term damage. And I think that that's what Copaganda is about, the long-term damage imposed by the incremental violences that we overlook or engage or look past. And so, the social construction of the criminal is so important and interesting. I'm probably at my end. It's so important and interesting. I did this project in my master's program where I went through all of these newspapers, like in the local Peoria area, and I mapped the crimes that were reported over the crime map on crimes that were actually committed, and it was wild in terms of they aren't reporting on what's happening most. They're reporting on what's happening in certain places being committed by certain people. And then also just evaluating the visual rhetoric of it, which my colleague next to me does visual rhetoric work. But evaluating that, this is what I found, and this is just sort of a takeaway. The types of crimes mattered, as did who committed them. White-collar crime, if you committed a white-collar crime, you got a headshot in the newspaper with a discussion of your accomplishments. If you were a blue-collar criminal, you got your mugshot in the newspaper with a discussion of your past offenses and involvements or accusations, even if you were the victim of the crime. Again, there's if we don't point these out, then the media, then the look-asides all just speak, because the silence is complicity, it's condoning. And as teacher scholars within our own discipline, we're called to counter that.
Thank you for allowing me to go last, because I didn't quite know what to expect or do. So I don't have much to say other than just in awe of the book and putting together this panel and hearing these perspectives. I think probably the majority of folks here are coming out of the within the criminal justice area, disciplinary wise, in the. Just even listen to that word, disciplinary. No, I meant the academic. Anyways, you can tell I don't really have much structurally prepared. And yes, I am just a rambling media studies professor with very much admiring the quality of the clarity of the writing. Oftentimes when I read critiques that include takedowns of the media, that's part of my kind of red flag of oh, the media, without them also kind of breaking down what they meant. But that is absolutely not what Alec's book is about. So I so appreciate the care to really untangle a lot of the I guess in a similar way of kind of pointing out the variety of factors, people involved, facets of the institutions, even the whole, I would highly advocate for pushing the punishment bureaucracy as a phrase to see how well it can butt out criminal justice. So it helps to see kind of that unpacking, and then it also then serves as a nice parallel, but definitely not parallel. It's all integrated with how the news media functions too, of how so many say if pointing out that there's various in the prison industrial kind of complex, if there's all these bad officers or there's some good ones in there and they're just doing the best that they can, and they don't have any room in order to push up against the power structure in a prison, for example. It's a similar kind of dynamic, you could say, within a news organization. So I appreciate that this isn't about a personal bias, and I very much appreciate the whole approach to the Chuck Schumer Democrats or the MSNBC liberals, who are just as susceptible to sharing all sorts of fake news headlines or memes that are kind of played out on equal sides about crime and reporting on that crime. So I'm sorry, none of this is really that coherent, other than just to say I would very much hope that punishment bureaucracy becomes a clear phrase, because there's a lot that by drawing on some of my favorites, like Stuart Hall, which Policing the Crisis being one of his earliest works coming out of the 70s cultural studies, but then up until his passed a number of years ago. But it's very much in the sense of so much of just the whole apparatus of all of the institutions preventing us from envisioning what different kinds of future can happen. So I think that's what's interesting about some of these the stories. I was writing down as Kaitlyn, for example, was talking about the crime prevention methods. If those are reported, first of all, by various local news organizations or national, if they are even reported, then at what point of the 30-minute newscast is it on? If it's at the very end, it's the happy-go-lucky kind of good feelings of the week kind of story that are completely undermined by the other 23 minutes of the newscast and also all of the ads in between. So that's precisely what is so powerful, I think, about having, for me, what seems like an outside perspective coming into about media, but then not at all outside perspective. If Alec has talked to so many reporters and news organizations and is part of this network of folks, hopefully training different media practitioners to treat this news differently. But then again, I'm so sorry, I'm going to end on a split of a pessimistic but also optimistic note, because another one of my faves are also in this book with Japis Lul. I'm bad at pronouncing his name, but a different book than Propaganda, but the Technological Society. And so I pulled a quote from that book, which I really thought helped further kind of help me make sense of giving a name to something I've been thinking about or teaching about in various media criticism, visual classes over the years, or even just in my own analyses of sitcoms and how anything that seems progressive is actually undermined by the overall narrative of it. Anyways, all that to say, the little quote, technique integrates the machine into society. It constructs the kind of world the machine needs. So that feels appropriate in kind of encapsulating it all. So that's the kind of pessimist point of saying there might be all these kind of smaller opportunities throughout our communities, or one police chief that might be making, I don't know, some kind of comments that seem on the face of it progressive, but then as you keep pulling back on the sources, as Alec so very clearly and nicely demonstrates throughout the book, or even just now talking about, which I then looked up that article too, in GLT, just being oh yeah, that is not a great take on policing here in Bloomington, or how the Springfield police chief also had that kind of take of nobody in the community wants to be a part of our police force, and we reached out to the NAACP and Black Lives Matter, and they didn't want anything with us, and that's just how the articles end. And you might try to kind of keep reforming things, but I'm so sorry with this pessimism. But on the news angle side of things, much like there's the prison industrial complex, there's also very much a news industrial kind of complex, and that is an undercurrent throughout the book, and I think explained in a way that is much sharper than some of the media critiques that I've read of how local news and the corporate news all function. I mean, an easy way to look at it is if you look at the websites of all of the Central Illinois newspapers, TV news stations, they all look exactly the same. They all have the same exact stories because they're all owned by the same corporation, and they all use the same thumbnail images of the same stock footage of the sirens going. But on the optimistic end, it's in the resisting propaganda about community, art, all of the things that end up bringing me joy, at least. So thank you for bringing me into your community.
Oh, yes, before we get to questions.
I think, unfortunately, we might not be able to get to questions. I might just give it to Alec just to wrap up with for 5 more minutes. Before I turn it over, though, I just wanted to thank our panelists, first of all, for all of you reading the book and willing to discuss it. Obviously, thank you, Alec, for being willing to zoom in from Los Angeles. That was huge. And then also thank you again for the 2026 Civic Engagement Grant from the ISU Senior Professionals. Also, if you didn't grab one of these, I put a great guide that comes from Alec's books on a Reader's Guide to Sources and Experts, where he kind of goes through some of the questions you should be asking when you're taking in news media. It also has some information at the bottom of how to find the work that Alec is doing through the Civil Rights Court. So please look at that. Also, the book raffle. I have 2 books. Open that thing. I have Melanie Sanchez Ponce. Still here? Perfect. And then I have Zay Ahmed. Is he still here? Thank you. All right, I'll turn it over to you, Alec. You have about 8 minutes, and then we have to go and you have to go. So tell us your final thoughts on what all the panel has said in 8 minutes.
Well, I feel bad that we didn't do any questions, so maybe if there's someone who has a burning question, we could take that.
Okay.
Yes. Burning questions.
Thank you. My name is Corey Bert. I am not a student or officially in education. I teach elementary school, but I'm in my local government. So my question for you was, given the fact that these systems are so entrenched and acknowledging the frequent crimes or crimes that police and law enforcement, crises that police and law enforcement find themselves in, what role do you see that local government has in its limited role of oversight over local departments in times like these?
That's a really important question because virtually no local government that I'm aware of exercises meaningful oversight over the police right now. I've been invited to consult with many local officials, mayors, city councils, prosecutors' offices even, and I tell a story of one of them in the book, I think. I can't remember what got cut from the book. It was such a long book that they cut so much, I don't even remember what made it in. But I think I tell the story of my testimony in San Francisco at the County Board of Supervisors Budget Committee meeting, and they literally could not get the police to tell them what the police were spending their money on. Even as they're being asked to vote to approve the overall police budget, they literally couldn't, they would not tell the Oversight Budget Committee what the line items were. This is a huge problem. I try in the end of the book, in chapter 16, to give a list of questions that any council member, any staff member who works at the county or the city government should be asking the police. And also, any public person could go to any hearing and just start asking the questions. And they're a very important list of questions that are a starting point for thinking about what's the kind of oversight that we should do of the police department. Because it's not happening at all. And one of the problems is there's not subject matter experts who work in a lot of these local governments who are able to even process some of the stuff that police tell them and figure out what are the next questions to ask. And so the police, on the other hand, have the same people working in those positions for years and years and years and years and years. So you've got a really knowledgeable repeat player against some aid for some council person who's going to be in a different job in a year and a half or 2 years. And so there's this information asymmetry that happens. So we need to do a better job of collectively, something that graduate students and professors can do a really great job in sort of producing little labs or clinics that kind of help local governments ask the right questions in the police budget process. That would be a very good place to start.
Budgets are moral documents.
Are there any questions that students have? So, or real quick.
I am an archaeology grad student, but I'm very interested in the topic. And I was wondering if we have any good talking points to introduce this subject to lay people or family members that might plant the seeds that maybe not everything is just in the justice system. Do you have any introductory points?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's so many different paths into this. You know, you could even just go watch court. Nobody who goes and watches a local court comes away with the thinking that all this is about justice. I wrote my first book called Usual Cruelty. There's an essay in the first book called The Punishment Bureaucracy. And that was my attempt to take everything I learned in the first 15 years of my career about the legal system and to write it up for just normal audience. You can just Google The Punishment Bureaucracy, and it's an article that's free to read. Also, by the way, we have a program for free paperback versions of my book, Usual Cruelty and Copaganda, for students who can't afford it. So if folks are interested in getting either book but don't want to pay for it, and all the royalties, by the way, go to an incredible nonprofit that works with unhoused people to fight against police repression. So definitely order it or have people you know order it. But if you can't afford it, maybe you can let Brenna know, and we can send a box of free books of either book to you all so that you can just engage with it. But the punishment bureaucracy is really my attempt to take people like my parents and many of my family who are not or were not very skeptical of the punishment bureaucracy, and to just show them with lots of examples in a really easily accessible way what exactly is the system doing and why is it so bad at making us safe, and why does it cost so much money, and why is it so brutal, and why is it focusing on the things that it focuses on and ignoring a lot of harm and crime as well. And I think so my answer is spend more time reading stuff that I've already written. But I think there's so many different ways of engaging. There's incredible films, there's incredible movies, TV shows that help you, documentaries. I tried to provide a little bit of a list in chapter 16 of Copaganda as well, of different podcasts, books, movies that I recommend. But the punishment bureaucracy essay that I wrote, which you could just read for free anytime, is probably the place that I start, just because that's where I put down all of my thoughts that I think, it was my attempt to convince people, or at least educate people about what's really going on in the system.
That's great, and I will say that I read it as a nighttime read, so it is a very entertaining read and easy to get into. So, is there anyone? No, it kept me awake. It's not a great. Is there a quick question?
Are we here till 7, or is it?
Oh, it's not till 7 because apparently the pre-dental society needs their room. So I don't know how many people there are, but apparently we don't get president.
Thank you. So I am somebody who is very sympathetic. I consider myself a defundist, but I haven't quite gotten to the abolitionist train. And the reason is because to me the police are the agent of the state with legitimate use of violence to enforce the sovereignty of the state. That's just how I define them. And even though these end up being, a really small minority of the total things that we call crimes, things like murder, rape, pedophilia, stuff like that, I still want those punished. Like, I still want there to be an agent that has the ability to use violence to deal with those problems. And so, what do you have to respond? Who is that in your ideal system that is going to have that role, even if it is a very tiny minority of all the crimes that are reported?
So I am going to answer this question, but I'm going to preface my answer with 2 things. One, I also have to go to another speaking engagement, so it's going to be more brief than I want, and then, frankly, your question deserves.
I'll email you. We can do an interview.
Feel free to email me. But I'll find another excuse to avoid answering this question, I'm sure. But I also just want to say, we can, I actually think before you get to the question of, should there be complete abolition, you can accomplish so much, because so much of the current system is just so clearly ridiculous and wasteful and unnecessary and harmful. So I think, when I talk to people about this, I'm like, look, I think you're making a really important point. We have a lot of, our society would have to look so different, because abolition, right, is not just removing police and prisons from our society and having the rest of it stay looking exactly the same. In order to have a society where those institutions aren't needed or aren't perceived to be needed, you have to have a radically different looking society. Now, that's possible. Keep in mind, for the first, several millennia of human history, there was nothing that even remotely resembled police or prisons. Okay, so it's totally possible if you had a really different looking society. But before we get into sort of what would it look like under my ideal world, we could have a society that looked more like American policing in prisons in 1940 or 50 or 60 or 70, or that looks more like essentially every other country in the world, right? So we could reduce the current policing and prison footprint in our society by 80%, and it would be about the same as it was from 1790 to 1970 in the United States. And it would be what it looks like in much of the rest of the world, almost the entire rest of the world. So the expenditure per capita, the number of incarcerated people, the extent of policing, surveillance, punishment, etc., is so far beyond what other societies are engaging in that, like, before we get to like really hard questions about like what do you do with really severe forms of harm, we could agree to like dismantle much of it, and then that later discussion would proceed in a much more natural and rational way, because the discussion wouldn't be distorted by these incredibly powerful and violent and threatening interests, which kind of just mangle and distort every public debate that we have about the punishment bureaucracy. So in terms of like the actually getting now to the answer to your question, I have never seen any evidence that human caging reduces the instances of predatory or violent behavior. I think in a different kind of world, we might have methods of exile and for the truly incorrigible, like if there was a situation where, like, and this is a very tiny number of people, almost infinitesimally small in a society that was actually meeting people's needs, you could have different forms of exile that didn't actually look like the current prison system. And there's lots of writing and debate about what that might look like in an ideal world. But we're so far from that world that I tend to find it kind of distracting, because a lot of people use the fact that they may not agree on full-scale abolition as an excuse not to just ratchet down the size and power of the punishment bureaucracy, and I think that's a mistake. And so that's why I tend to focus on, well, let's reduce it to where it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and 15 and 20 years ago, and let's take those resources and let's invest them in things people need, early childhood education, like Medicaid expansion, universal health care, creating opportunities for people in communities to have more connection, to reduce levels of loneliness and isolation, housing, investing in universal basic income, and things like that are proven to actually reduce the extent to which people harm each other. So sorry I had to give such an abbreviated and incomplete answer to that, but I'm glad we did questions, and I do have to run, but
Yeah, thank you so much, Alec. Can we give them a round of applause and a panel? Thank you again for coming. We all really appreciate it. Also, there are 2 more books available for sale. They're $20, which is about $15 less than Amazon, so you're welcome. Come get them outside if you want them. Thank you, Alec.
Thank you all so much to the panelists for reading the book and for coming to this event. It was really an honor to have you guys comment on the book, and I hope our paths cross again.
Oh, I'm
Thank
going
you
to
so
love
much.
you for our student youth station to do a bad landlord of the week. Yeah, it's so necessary to really.
Yes, thank you so much.